Eric, considering the regulatory landscape, how do existing regulations and industry standards impact the assessment and management of D&D charges? And are there any upcoming regulatory changes that businesses should be mindful of?
Ooh, so we could spend a whole hour just on this one question. So I would say I'll just start with that. Standards are sort of few and far to come by. I think as sort of alluded to a second ago, there's not really any, or I should say historically, there was not really any sort of standardized invoice or time frame for invoice that was required by law. That changed with a rewrite of the U.S. This is in the U.S. at least, the U.S. Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which was passed. The OSRA 22 was passed in mid 22. That attempted to create some level of normalcy across all invoices, including any for detention and demurrage. So that required there was 13 data elements in every invoice. It required invoices to be accurate, or else they could be deemed, the payee would not have to pay them until they were corrected. Obviously, that's a subjective term, obviously, and there's a whole set of dispute processes that are now in place to address those. I think the problem in regulating this is, we could come up with 10 different hypothetical examples right now of D&D being potentially misappropriately applied. And all 10 of those would be 10 totally different problems, right? And so it's very hard to regulate a set of processes that have so many different permutations without creating a bunch of unintended consequences that might be worse. You don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, right? So I think the FMC has been, the Federal Maritime Commission has been quite deliberate in trying to figure out a way to get their arms around this in a way that doesn't make the problem worse. And one of those ways is earlier, just a couple months ago in February, I believe, they put out a rule. This was part of the OSRA, the aftermath of OSRA 22. They had to put out a rule about D&D invoicing. And the major change in that rule that was announced, and this goes into effect at the end of May, is anyone charging detention demurrage has to bill the party that is in the contract. Earlier, I mentioned how often drayage providers end up getting the bill or having to pay a fee literally at the gate to get a container out. That practice has to end. Now, if the shipper has to be the one that's billed. Doesn't mean the drayage provider or 3PL or a customs broker can't pay that bill on their behalf, but the bill cannot be sent to those third parties that were not part of the original contract. So that is one major change that I think a lot of people are generally happy with. It's definitely a change of process for some shippers that have not been used to receiving bills and are now going to start receiving bills and have to pass them along to their providers if the providers are the ones who agree to pay it on their behalf. But I think overall, it's a good thing for the intermediary community that essentially has been, over the years, fronting a lot of money and having to claw it back. And most of these companies are on pretty thin margins and don't necessarily have the cash flow to make that work. So that would be the one that I would be focused on at this point. There's another set of, I had mentioned there's 13 data elements that now have to be in an invoice. There's also another 7 elements that are set to be added, but they have to go through sort of a regulatory process within the US government, the Office of OMB, I forget the acronym, what it stands for, but that's sort of a hurdle that those 7 data elements have to go through. They have to go through scrutiny from that agency, and then that will be added. So we might have as many as 20 data elements that have to be on an invoice for it to be considered a valid detention demurrage invoice.
Yep.
And one thing, and again, we could go on and on about just this topic. One thing that's important to understand on the dispute side of this is OSTRA essentially created some new avenues for shippers or shipper representatives to dispute charges they believe to be inaccurate or lacking that data invoice. There's now 4 channels essentially to dispute beyond just going back to the carrier or the terminal and saying, here, I have proof that this charge that you applied to me is not valid. You can, and I won't go through all of them because again, that would take another 30 minutes, but it sort of ranges from kind of like small claims court to all the way to formal process, long-term process in front of the FMC, have them consider and adjudicate whether, you know, a shipper has been wronged essentially. So there's a lot more channels and the channels are meant to, where appropriate, expedite the process. So it's not a years long process to try to get back what oftentimes is not a huge amount of money, but it's still, you know, inappropriately charged.